Flights are $1,200, Mom said. If you can't pay, stay. I nodded and started making a plan. What I discovered about my family's real intentions made me realize I wasn't just being controlled financially. I was being trapped, and when I finally broke free, everything changed. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Tuesday evening in March, exactly 3 weeks before my 31st birthday. I was sitting in my small but cozy apartment in Asheville, North Carolina, laptop balanced, on my knees, surrounded by design mockups for a local brewery's rebrand. The golden hour light was streaming through my kitchen window, hitting the succulents I'd finally managed to keep alive for more than 6 months, for the first time in years. My life felt like it was actually mine. I'm Sophia Chen Martinez, and, at 30, I was finally hitting my stride as a freelance graphic designer. It had taken me 8 years since college to build up the courage to leave my soul-crushing corporate job at a marketing firm in Charlotte and strike out on my own. The transition hadn't been easy. There were months where I lived on ramen and anxiety, questioning every decision, but I'd made it work. My client list was growing, my portfolio was strong, and for the first time since graduating from Davidson College, I had actual savings in my bank account. That's why when my college roommate Isabel called me from San Francisco with the most exciting news of her life, I didn't hesitate for even a second. "Sophia, oh my God, I'm getting married." She practically screamed through the phone, her voice crackling with joy and terrible reception. "What, when, who? Tell me everything." I abandoned my laptop and started pacing around my living room, grinning like an idiot. "His name is Alessandro, he's Italian, we met when I was doing that consulting project in Milan last year. Remember I told you about him? Well, he proposed last weekend in Golden Gate Park with this incredible ring his grandmother left him, and Sophia, we're having the wedding in Tuscany, in his family's vineyard. Can you believe it?" I could barely believe it. Isabel and I had been roommates for 3 years at Davidson, and she'd been my anchor through some of the darkest moments of college. When my grandfather died sophomore year and I was too broke to fly home for the funeral, she'd driven 12 hours with me to Knoxville, Tennessee, stayed for the service, and drove me back without asking for gas money. When I had that awful panic attack during finals junior year and couldn't stop crying in our dorm room, she sat with me all night, making tea and helping me study for my art history exam. She was the kind of friend who remembered your favorite coffee order 5 years later and still sent you funny memes at 2 a.m. "The wedding is in September," she continued, her voice getting dreamy. "September 15th, right at sunset, overlooking the valley. His family has this amazing old villa, and Sophia, I want you to be my maid of honor. I know it's international and expensive, but you're my person. I can't do this without you there." My heart swelled and broke a little at the same time. Of course I wanted to be there. Of course I wanted to stand beside my best friend as she married the love of her life in what sounded like a fairy tale setting. But the practical part of my brain, the part that had been trained since childhood to think about money first, dreams second, immediately started calculating. "Izzy, I would be honored to be your maid of honor. But let me look at flights and hotels and figure out if I can make it work financially." "Okay, of course. No pressure. I just had to ask you first." After we hung up, I spent the next 2 hours researching everything. Flights from Charlotte to Florence in September, $1,200 if I booked soon, probably more if I waited. Hotels in the area, $150 to $300 per night for a decent place, food, transportation, a bridesmaid dress, wedding gift, time off work. I was looking at easily $3,000 for the trip, probably more. Here's the thing though, I had it. I'd been religiously saving $250 every month since I went freelance, building up an emergency fund that had grown into something more like an opportunity fund. I had $8,500 in savings, plus my regular checking account buffer. This trip wouldn't even wipe out half my savings, but as I sat there looking at the numbers on my laptop screen, I felt that familiar knot forming in my stomach. The same knot I'd been feeling since childhood whenever I wanted something that cost money. Even though I was 30 years old, living independently, supporting myself entirely, I could hear my mother's voice in my head. Is that really necessary? Couldn't you save that money for something more important? Don't you think that's a little selfish? I shook my head, trying to clear out those old voices. This was my decision to make. My money, my life, my best friend's wedding. I picked up my phone to call my parents. Not because I needed their permission, but because I wanted to share this exciting news with them. I thought they'd be happy for me, maybe even proud that I'd built a business successful enough to afford international travel. I should have known better. My parents, Richard and Patricia Holloway, lived in a sprawling suburban house in Meridian Hills, just outside of Indianapolis. My dad was a mid-level manager at an insurance company, and my mom worked part-time as a bookkeeper for a dental practice. They weren't wealthy, but they weren't struggling either. Solidly middle class with a mortgage, 2 car payments, and the kind of financial anxiety that they wore like a badge of honor. "Hi, Mom," I said when she picked up on the 3rd ring. I could hear the TV in the background, some home renovation show she was probably half watching while organizing something unnecessarily. "Sophia, how nice to hear from you. How's work going? Are you getting enough clients?" I saw an article about how freelancers don't have job security, and I keep worrying. Work is going really well, actually. That's kind of why I'm calling. I have some exciting news. I told her about Isabel's wedding, about the maid of honor invitation, about the vineyard in Tuscany. I tried to make it sound as magical as it felt, hoping she'd catch some of my enthusiasm. The silence on the other end of the line lasted just a beat too long. "Well," she said finally, her voice taking on that particular tone I knew so well, the one that meant she was about to rain on my parade with practical concerns. "That sounds lovely for Isabel. But Sophia, honey, have you thought about how much something like that would cost?" "I have, actually. I've been looking at flights, and flights are $1,000 to $100, she interrupted, and I could tell she'd already been Googling while I was talking. "That's just for flights. Plus hotels, food, time off work, clothes, gifts. You're probably looking at $4,000 when all is said and done." The number was higher than my estimate, but not impossibly so. "It's expensive, but Mom, she's my best friend. She was my maid of honor when I thought I was going to marry Jake back in college. Remember, this is important, Sophia." Her voice got that patient, explaining to a child quality that made me feel about 12 years old. "You're 30 years old. You should be thinking about your future. What about buying a house? What about retirement savings? What about what happens if you get sick and can't work?" My father's voice chimed in from the background. He must have been listening on speaker. "When I was your age, I was focused on building stability, not taking vacation trips." "It's not a vacation, Dad. It's my best friend's wedding. It's still a luxury," Mom said firmly and frankly. "If you have $4,000 to spend on a trip to Italy, I'm confused about why you can only visit us twice a year. Do you know how much we spend on plane tickets to come see you last Christmas? How much we spend every time we want to see our daughter?" There it was, the guilt. The pivot that made my choices about my life somehow about them and their feelings. I felt that familiar sinking sensation, like the ground was shifting beneath my feet. "Mom, I visit as much as I can. I was just there for Thanksgiving, and you came here for Christmas. We see each other plenty." She repeated the word, like it tasted bitter. "Twice a year is plenty to see your parents who raised you and supported you and helped you through college." "You didn't help me through college, Mom. I had student loans and worked 2 jobs. We helped as much as we could, and we certainly didn't teach you to be irresponsible with money." The conversation was spiraling in a direction I recognized but couldn't seem to stop. Every time I tried to talk to my parents about anything I wanted to do with my life, it somehow became about what I wasn't doing for them, how I wasn't grateful enough, how I was making poor choices they couldn't support. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "I'm not asking for your money or your approval. I'm just sharing something exciting that's happening in my life. And we're just trying to help you think it through realistically," Dad said. "Sophia, you've always been impulsive. Remember when you quit that good job in Charlotte to start freelancing? We warned you that was risky. That was 2 years ago, and it worked out fine. Better than fine. Did it? Because if you're barely scraping together money for plane tickets to see your family, I'm not barely scraping together anything. The words came out sharper than I intended. I have savings. I have a successful business. I can afford this trip. Another pause. I could practically hear them exchanging glances. Sophia, Mom said, her voice getting softer, more concerned. Maybe the issue isn't whether you can technically afford it. Maybe the issue is whether you should. Whether it's the right priority for someone in your position. What position is that? Single, freelancing, no real job security, no house, no retirement plan that we know of. Honey, we love you, but you're not exactly in a position to be throwing money around on luxury travel. Every word hit like a small punch to the gut. Single like that was a failure rather than a choice. Freelancing like my business wasn't real work. No house like renting was somehow shameful. No retirement plan despite the fact that I'd been contributing to a SEP IRA for 2 years. I'm not throwing money around, I said quietly. This is my best friend's wedding. And if you can't afford to go responsibly, then maybe you shouldn't go, Mom said matter-of-factly. If you can't pay for something like this without compromising your financial security, then stay home. Family should come first anyway. When's the last time you spent $4,000 visiting us? The question hung in the air like a trap. When was the last time I'd spent anything close to $4,000 visiting them? Never, because visiting them meant a $300 flight and staying in my childhood bedroom for free. But somehow that didn't matter. Somehow the fact that I was considering spending my own money on something that would make me happy was being framed as a betrayal of family values. You're probably right, I heard myself saying. Even though every fiber of my being was screaming that they were wrong, I should think about it more. That's our smart girl, Dad said, and I could hear the approval in his voice. The same approval I'd been chasing my entire life. You'll thank us later for helping you think it through. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen as the golden hour light faded to blue, feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. My laptop was still open to the flight booking page, cursor blinking in the departure date field. My phone was still warm from the call. Everything was exactly the same as it had been an hour ago. But something fundamental had shifted. I looked around my apartment that I paid for in a city I'd chosen, decorated with art I'd bought with money I'd earned. I looked at my portfolio on the coffee table, full of work I was proud of. I looked at my bank account on the laptop screen, showing the savings I'd accumulated through discipline and hard work, and I felt like none of it was real. Like I was still a child playing dress-up in an adult life, waiting for the real adults to tell me what I was allowed to want. But here's what started bothering me as I sat there in the growing darkness. The numbers didn't add up to the panic in their voices. $1,200 for flights, maybe $3,000 total for the whole trip. I spent more than that on rent every 4 months. I'd spent more than that on my laptop and camera equipment for work. I'd spent more than that on the security deposit and moving costs. When I'd moved to Asheville, why was this different? Why was this the expense that was irresponsible and impulsive and dangerous to my financial future? And why did I feel guilty for even asking myself these questions? I closed the laptop and went to bed, but I didn't sleep much. I kept thinking about the tone in my mother's voice when she said, if you can't pay responsibly, then stay. Not if you can't afford it, but if you can't pay responsibly. Like the money wasn't really the issue. Like there was some other standard I was failing to meet. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of determination. Maybe it was the 8 hours of lying awake thinking, or maybe it was the way the morning light made my apartment look particularly beautiful and particularly mine, but I felt different, clearer. I made coffee, opened my laptop, and started doing something I'd never done before. I started tracking exactly where my money went and exactly where my parents' concern was coming from. What I found changed everything. Over the next 3 days, I went through 2 years of my bank statements, my tax returns, my business expenses. I made spreadsheets. I calculated my actual monthly expenses, my actual income, my actual savings rate. I researched average freelancer earnings, average retirement savings for people my age, average travel spending. And then I did something that felt almost rebellious. I started tracking every conversation I'd had with my parents about money over the past 5 years. The pattern that emerged made my stomach turn every time I'd wanted to spend money on something. For myself, a weekend trip to visit college friends, a nice camera for work, a deposit on a better apartment. My parents had responded with concern about my financial responsibility. But every time they'd needed money, or had a financial emergency, or wanted help with something, my responsibility was measured by how quickly I said yes. When they'd needed help with car repairs 2 years ago, there was no conversation about whether I could responsibly afford the $800 they'd asked for. When my father had wanted to take a golf trip with his college buddies last year, no one had questioned the cost or suggested he should prioritize family visits instead. The rules, I realized, were different for my money than for theirs. My money was always scrutinized, always potentially irresponsible, always up for debate. Their money was private, their decisions were final, and my role was to support, not question. But it was more than just the double standard that bothered me. Was the way these conversations always ended with me feeling small and guilty and wrong for wanting things. The way I'd internalized their voice so completely that I couldn't make a decision about my own life without hearing their disapproval. I was 30 years old. I had built a business from scratch, survived the transition from corporate work to freelancing, created a life I loved in a city that felt like home. I had savings, health insurance, retirement contributions, and a solid emergency fund. By any objective measure, I was doing well. So why did I feel like I was failing every time I wanted something that cost money? On Friday evening, 3 days after that phone call, I sat down with my laptop and did something that felt both terrifying and necessary. I started making a plan. Not the plan they wanted me to make, the one where I stayed home and saved money, and visited them more often and felt guilty for wanting things. A different plan. A plan to figure out why a 30-year-old woman with her own life, her own money, and her own success felt like she needed permission to spend her own money on her best friend's wedding. A plan to understand why financial independence had never translated into emotional independence. A plan to figure out what it would look like to make decisions based on what I wanted and what made sense for my life, rather than what would earn approval from people who seemed determined to disapprove. I opened a new browser tab and started researching flights to Florence, not because I definitely decided to go, but because I definitely decided to stop letting other people make my decisions for me. What I discovered over the next few weeks about my family's real intentions, about the patterns I'd been blind to my entire life, would change everything I thought I knew about love, control, and what it means to be responsible for your own life. But that night, sitting in my apartment with my laptop open and my coffee getting cold, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: the possibility that my life could be mine. Really, truly mine. The possibility that I could want things without permission, choose things without approval, and love people without losing myself in the process. It was a small feeling, fragile and new, but it was there, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I decided to trust it. What you need to understand about my relationship with my parents is that it didn't start out toxic. It started out normal, maybe even loving in its own complicated way, but somewhere along the line, normal became a cage I didn't even realize I was living in. Growing up in Meridian Hills was like living inside a Norman Rockwell painting that someone had adjusted the color saturation on just slightly too high. Everything looked perfect from the outside: the manicured lawns, the 2-car garages, the neighborhood barbecues where everyone knew everyone else's business but pretended they didn't. My father Richard worked his steady insurance job, came home at 5:30 every weekday, and spent Saturdays washing his Toyota Camry in the driveway. My mother Patricia kept house, worked her part-time bookkeeping job, and made sure our family looked exactly like what people expected a good family to look like. The Holloway family values were simple: work hard, save money, don't make waves, and always, always prioritize security over dreams. We weren't wealthy, but we weren't poor either. We were the kind of family that clipped coupons not because we had to, but because it was the responsible thing to do. We were the kind of family that bought the store-brand cereal and felt virtuous about it. We were the kind of family that viewed any unnecessary expense as a moral failing. I learned early that love in our house was conditional on making the right choices. The right choices were always the safe choices, the practical choices. The choices that saved money and avoided risk. When I was 8 and wanted to take art classes, my parents suggested I check out art books from the library instead. Why spend money when you can learn for free? When I was 12 and wanted to go to summer camp with my friends, they enrolled me in a free day program at the community center. You'll have just as much fun, and we won't go into debt for it. The message was always the same: wanting things that cost money was selfish. Being satisfied with less was virtuous. And the people who loved you would help you want less, not encourage you to want more. I was the good daughter. I got good grades. I worked part-time jobs as soon as I was old enough. I applied for scholarships and chose Davidson College partly because they offered me the best financial aid package. I studied graphic design because it seemed like a practical, creative field, creative enough to satisfy my artistic impulses, practical enough to satisfy my parents' concerns about employment prospects. Even in college, I felt their influence. While my roommate Isabel was studying abroad in Paris and taking spring break trips to Florida, I was working in the campus computer lab and going home for breaks to save money. When my friends went out to restaurants, I suggested cooking at home. When they wanted to see concerts or shows, I found free campus events instead. I told myself I was being responsible. I told myself I was avoiding the debt trap that caught so many of my classmates. And maybe that was partly true, but I was also avoiding experiences, avoiding opportunities, avoiding the chance to figure out what I actually wanted instead of what I thought I should want. "Sophia, you have a good job with benefits," my mother would say. "Do you know how many people would kill for that kind of security? You're throwing away everything you've worked for," Mom said, her voice tight with disappointment. 5 years of building your career, just gone. What if you can't find clients? What if you get sick and can't work? What if the economy crashes? Dad's questions came rapid fire, each one designed to highlight a different catastrophic possibility I hadn't considered. "You've always been impulsive, Sophia. You've always wanted things you couldn't have, but this isn't college anymore. This is real life. You can't just quit your job because you're bored." Impulsive, that word followed me everywhere. Anytime I wanted to make a change, try something new, take a risk, I was being impulsive. Anytime I prioritized my happiness over security, I was being irresponsible. Anytime I spent money on something that wasn't a necessity, I was being frivolous. Freelancing is so unstable. What happens when you don't have work for a few months? Are you sure you're charging enough? Are you sure you're saving enough for taxes? Maybe you should look for a part-time job, just as backup. It was like they needed me to fail, or at least, they needed me to be perpetually on the verge of failure. Always dependent on their advice, always grateful for their concern, always small enough to fit into their understanding of what my life should look like. Moving to Asheville was another battle. I'd found a perfect apartment in a city I'd fallen in love with during a work trip. The cost of living was lower than Charlotte, the creative community was thriving, and I already had 2 potential clients lined up. It made perfect sense. "Why do you need to move so far away?" Mom asked. "What's wrong with Charlotte?" "What? If your business doesn't work out there, at least in Charlotte you had connections. Asheville is expensive, and it's full of hippies and artists who don't understand real work." But I moved anyway. And you know what? It was the best decision I'd made in years. My business grew faster than it ever had in Charlotte. I found a community of creative professionals who understood what I did and valued what I brought to the table. I made friends who encouraged my goals instead of questioning them. I built a life that felt authentic and sustainable and mine. For the first time since college, I was genuinely happy. I was proud of my work, excited about my future, confident in my abilities. I had savings, I had stability, I had success by any reasonable measure. The phone calls continued like clockwork every Sunday evening. The questions were always the same. Was I getting enough work? Was I saving enough money? Had I thought about getting a real job with benefits? When was I going to visit them? Why didn't I call more often? And underneath all the questions was the same message I'd been hearing my entire life. You're not doing enough. You're not safe enough. You're not grateful enough. You need us more than you think you do. I started dreading those calls. I started letting them go to voicemail and calling back when I felt emotionally prepared to defend my life choices. I started editing my stories, leaving out the parts about client successes or new opportunities or things I was excited about, because I knew they'd find something wrong with every piece of good news. By the time Isabel called me about her wedding, I had built a successful business, created a beautiful life, and achieved a level of independence that should have made me proud. But I still felt like a child asking permission every time I wanted something that my parents might not approve of. I still felt like my money wasn't really mine, my choices weren't really mine. My life wasn't really mine. And I was so used to feeling that way that I thought it was normal. I thought it was what family love looked like. I thought I was lucky to have parents who cared enough to worry about me. I had no idea how wrong I was.